Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, the year is off to a fierce start, and we are going to keep on the most important issue on the globe, which is Ukraine and all things connected to it. A lot of folks in the media are changing their focus. We are not. We're going to keep it here, and we're bringing back a returning champion. I think one of the best journalists in the world, a friend of the show, the great and powerful Dan Lamothe is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, sir.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So I did wear my Giants shirt, especially for you, because you're a Massachusetts guy. And I just want you to know that. And my condolences on the Patriots. I don't know how you're feeling about the Pats right now.
You know, I'm actually kind of looking at it as the intervention they need. I feel like they were kind of spluttering around with, inept coaching and some other things that they need to fix. And if they had made the playoffs and even won one game, I feel like we'd be doing this all over again next year. So maybe it's for the best.
It may be, and I think it's going to be fun because there are going to be Brady rumors, even though he's probably going to go to Vegas or somewhere else. It's going to be fun to watch that. But we're going to cut through rumors and get to facts. That's what you specialize in. I want to start by welcoming you back. You've been here many times before. We've talked about Afghanistan. We've talked about the insurrection. You're always in the mix of the most important military and defense stuff happening now. And to that point, where are you and how are you?
I'm good. I'm on a week-long tour of Europe, traveling with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley. We left on Sunday. We're in Brussels at the moment. He has been today in a meeting with NATO chiefs, so top military officers from numerous allies. We're kind of off to the side, kind of doing other work today. There isn't much for us that we can fall in on today. But in the last couple of days, I've been in Grafenwehr, the Army training base in Germany. Yesterday, I was in southeastern Poland, where General Milley split off and went to go meet with General Zaluzhny, just inside Poland, on the Polish side of the border. They met for a couple hours. He came back, and we flew from there up to Brussels.
I want to talk about that meeting. I want to talk about the deployment of new weapons, Patriot missiles. We've now got Ukrainian troops training at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. We're pushing, there's a push for tanks, for F-16s. But just can you take us inside? What is it like to travel with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs? This meeting, I think, was announced publicly after it happened. It seems like, right, in respect for operational security. But as folks know, I've got COVID right now. You're going through multiple cities. What is it like now? In this environment, the security environment, the COVID environment, the political environment. What's it like to travel with Milley right now?
Yeah, the COVID situation has normalized. It's basically traveling back to normal, with the caveat that we all know if anyone comes down with it, they are going to be left behind for obvious reasons. Right. And then you would hold in place and presumably at this point in the world and at this point in time, spend a few days and hopefully be back on your feet. So there was a point where we did a lot of testing on these trips. And that goes for traveling with the defense secretaries and others as well, where it was, I remember doing one trip with Secretary Austin pre-vaccination where we tested, I think, like 7 times in the span of like 9 days. It was pretty arduous. And those were the deep factory reset versions of those tests. It was significant. They were trying to do everything they could to keep people healthy.
And do you train? I don't know how this works. The press corps travels with the president on Air Force One. Do you travel on, Chairman of Joint Chiefs One, or how does that work with the press corps and him?
A lot of the U.S. officials. So the defense secretary has the E-4B, often called the Doomsday plane. At this point, it's a very old plane, decades old. You walk in there, it feels like 1975. The old screens, the old phones on the wall. It needs work. It needs help, and it's occasionally down for maintenance as well. The chairman does not have his own plane per se. but there's a fleet of they look sort of like mini Air Force Ones, same paint job, kind of the blue and white United States of America down the side. Traditionally, we travel in one of those. The C-40s is the most common airframe that I've been on for these trips that are sort of chairman trips or smaller defense secretary trips. So it's kind of like traveling on I don't know, maybe a Southwest flight with bigger seats. It kind of has that feel in terms of the size of the plane. And
hopefully without the delays that we saw from Southwest over Christmas time.
I was one of those folks caught with that too.
Do you get word? Do they say, "Hey, man, he's leaving in 24 hours. Let's go," or how does that happen? Was this a pre-planned trip? How do you get notification? And how many other people are in that crew in the press that is alongside you?
So I think on this one I got notification about a week in advance that they were going to Europe. There's some obvious events on the schedule. We all know there was a Ukraine contact group scheduled this week. That is a part of the schedule for late this week. That and alone with an invitation made it where if I can fit it in my schedule, I will go. I didn't know about the stop in southeastern Poland till late. I had already committed and then found out. And I definitely didn't know about the visit with General Zaluzhny till like really 12 hours out from him actually doing that. That was actually a late add to the schedule. It seems like they were looking for a spot to meet somewhere in Europe. The hope had been that Zaluzhny would actually be able to make it to the NATO meeting. He will be joining remotely, and they apparently went to Plan B and met just inside Poland.
So Zaluzhny is their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? The equivalent on the Ukrainian side. And can you talk about? In my view, this is a show of strength, right? He's as close as Milley is as close as he can be without going into the Ukrainian land. This is coming off the heels of announcing that we're sending Patriot batteries. There continue to be calls for tanks, for Bradleys, for Strikers, for F-16s. But can you talk about the significance of this meeting and what your reporting has found out about what happened in that meeting?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's meant to show, the symbolism of it is, I think, the most important aspect, at least in terms of the public messaging of it. The fact that they are willing to find time in their busy schedules for this, the fact that they are willing to kind of publicly announce that they are doing this. They have been speaking regularly, at least monthly, and probably messages exchanged in other formats in between. So. At this point, they know each other. They speak often enough, but they had actually never met in person, at least since the invasion. I can't speak for prior to the invasion, but this is their first in-person meeting since the invasion. So it almost gets to, at some point, weird if you're not able to find a spot to meet. We're also walking a weird line here. We've seen Defense Secretary Austin, Secretary of State Blinken. They have both made visits to Kyiv. We have an ambassador. We have an embassy in Kyiv again. We've seen kind of that next tier down, Deputy Secretary of State, Undersecretary of Defense. Several of them went to Kyiv a couple of days ago as well. General Milley has not been in Kyiv. He has not been in Ukraine, to anyone's knowledge. And the distinction seems to be that if you're not assigned to the U.S. Embassy and sort of that specific security mission focus there, which has, I think, a 1-star general, a couple dozen troops. If you're not assigned to that, no one else is going in, and that apparently applies to the chairman as well.
And the significance being no one else in uniform, right? Those other folks you mentioned are civilian appointees or civilian leadership at the Pentagon, but it would be a massive statement to the world if we had any rank of U.S. troop beyond our embassy security going into Ukraine. So they're walking that fine line. Patriots is front and center right now. To me, it seems like something that could have been done a long time ago. We talked last week with Nolan Peterson, who was living in Kyiv and experiencing the missile attacks and the bombings. Can you talk about the Patriots as you see them? We've got also Ukrainian troops training at Fort Sill. I don't think this is such a big deal. I was on a news network and they said, this is shocking or this is provocative. We train, foreign troops all the time, But how do you view this increase in the weapon system? We've now got Patriots in play, and that training component where we've got Ukrainian troops on U.S. soil in a high visibility way.
Yeah, I think a couple things are significant. Yes, I mean, not only have we trained foreign troops for any number of things going back many years, we've trained Ukrainian troops in the United States for other reasons.
Right.
So I mean, there was actually Ukrainian troops in the United States when the invasion happened.
Right.
So like there's all of that nuance that's probably important to add. As far as the Patriot, it becomes a system that, it's a very highly desired system by many nations in normal times. But I think you reach a point where, you see day after day what's happening with drone attacks, missile attacks, and other things in Ukraine. And at some point it goes from being, well, hey, Ukraine's going to fall anyway, we won't be able to get it there in time, to it's not, it's foreseeable to picture a wave of missile attacks like this a year from now, potentially. So I hear the argument that it should have been done a while ago. I can at least take that on board as part of this discussion. But the bottom line is they reached a point where they're willing to send it. Germany is also willing to send it. Now we're having a discussion of the Netherlands potentially also sending it. There's any number of other air defense systems that have also been added to the mix. So collectively, the hope is that you're able to not necessarily get every missile, but knock down a good portion of these collectively by the time you're there. It's going to take months before you're likely to see this American Patriot system being useful in Ukraine. But they've at least got the ball rolling now. The second piece we're not clear on yet, it came up yet at the Pentagon, is how the second system, Germany has offered a system. But there's no clarity yet on whether that means Germany will also be training Ukrainian troops on the Patriot, and when. Do we end up with another wave of Ukrainians following the first one, training in the United States to fall in on another Patriot system? That's the sort of stuff that's just, they're still going to have to sort through it. I think there's a lot more to come there.
So Dan, I've called this a giant game of Mother May I. It feels like the Ukrainians have to come with hat in hand and say, thank you, sir. May I have another? Can I have one more thing? Can I have one more thing? Can I have one more thing? And we haven't opened the gun chest and said, okay, guys, take everything you need to win this fight. And I think others would argue that we've given Ukraine enough to defend themselves for now, but not to win. And there's more we can do. The calls now specifically seem to be requests for tanks. German tanks. They're asking for Panzer tanks and other tanks. I think many like me would be fine with the Abrams going over, and Bradleys and Strykers and any other types of tanks and armored personnel carriers. Do you have any read on whether or not that's going to happen, how soon it could happen, and where General Milley himself is on this? I know he's tight-lipped, but at the time, sometimes he's not. And then I guess the next step would also be F-16s. If we had been training Ukrainians on F-16, they would already be in the fight. So does that feel like the next sequencing for you, or are there other things in there that we might not be tracking on?
I think they're now to the point where they're taking things a couple months at a time as opposed to a week at a time, or, what can we get to them that they immediately then use, 2 days after they get. So all of the discussion right now is really focused on two subjects: armor and more air defense. Those seem to be the two primary things. Now, the air defense is for obvious reasons. We've all seen these apartment buildings get hit, the electrical grid get hit. It's for that largely. The armor, you marry that up with the Ukrainians themselves openly talking about launching a renewed counteroffensive. So the expectation becomes at some point that Ukraine is able to marry up these new Bradley fighting vehicles, things they're getting from Europe, personnel carriers of a variety of kinds, more MRAPs, more Humvees, really anything that they can get their hands on that moves with some level of protection, even if it's just from small arms, and that they would, turn that into a coherent counteroffensive. Now, there's a lot that we're not hearing in the open source yet in terms of how they're organizing, what that looks like, which towns they prioritize. But the expectation would be whether it's weeks from now or months from now, you're probably going to see Ukraine try to take back more territory in a serious way. Mm-hmm. And you're now seeing the Pentagon openly say that they're trying to help Ukraine take back territory.
Mm. Dan, in the backdrop of all this, we've got a new Congress and a new wave of fuckery and shenanigans. Some significant things we've seen impacting the military is the rollback of the COVID mandate. Is there anything else that the Pentagon is bracing for? It feels like, the GOP wants to try to reignite conversations around things like the trans ban, things that have been divisive regarding diversity. What are they bracing for? And if you had to predict, if Milley's sitting there saying, okay, I have to plan on the war front, but I also have to plan on the political front, what else could be coming that they anticipate from Congress and Kevin McCarthy and the new leadership that could occupy their time?
In terms of what the Republicans will do, I'm not sure, largely, but in terms of things that they've messaged they could do, I think you're certainly going to see some additional kinds of investigation on Afghanistan. And there's some probably very fair oversight to be done there that hasn't been done yet. So I think that's one thing that the Pentagon is particularly wary of, but it's the State Department, it's the White House. It goes beyond the Pentagon on that front. We're probably going to see hearings. We're going to see potentially subpoenas if there's not cooperation. That could go any number of ways in coming months. We're waiting to see whether or not that's a single committee that looks at this, whether there's some sort of cooperation among committees. I'm not quite sure yet. And we did a front page story on that a few weeks back, and that's basically where the discussion was at that point. Was it's not clear whether we end up with a select committee, a specific committee, multiple different hearings on different committees. I don't know, but that's certainly a part of the conversation. On Ukraine, you're continuing to see a specific kind and a specific number of lawmakers look for ways that they can get in the way of additional money, weapons, support going. But the leadership is not quite there yet, particularly Senator McConnell does not seem to be there. He's very much behind Ukraine. He's openly saying so. So I have a hard time seeing in the short term any of that changing. Whether that holds a year from now, 2 years from now, I don't know. And then when you start getting into some other things, the culture war type of stuff, I think one piece, the vaccine is no longer required. We're still sorting through what that means for people that left the service because they wouldn't get the vaccine. Do they come back? Do they want to come back? Do they get back pay for the period they were not out? Those are the things that are being asked right now. Not all of them are settled.
I want to just stay on this for a second. So now that the vaccine mandate is being rolled back, is there anyone tasked with tracking the readiness impact of that? I mean, if you're on a plane like the one with Milley, where his staff doesn't have to be vaccinated anymore, and he could get sick, we could see people that have to lose work time, right? Is there anyone tasked with tracking that, or will they be reporting on that to the public?
I mean, certainly they're keeping track of who comes down with it. One thing that I've had a couple conversations with defense officials that there's sort of the twofold. There's the immediate reaction to the announcement, and then there's probably a rolling impact. Now, the announcement's made. We're no longer in 2020. It's not everywhere. And 97, 98% of the force at this moment is vaccinated. So there's no necessarily immediate, sprawling, in terms of what it could mean, how it could affect people. It still largely should be protected. Over time, 98, 95, 92, 87%, where do you end up 2, 3, 5 years out? And you got to marry that with where does the virus end up? And both of those are kind of unknown right now.
Last question I want to ask you, and you've generously agreed to stick around for a couple of questions that our Patreon members will hear. We're going to do football predictions. I'm going to ask Dan to predict the playoff games this weekend. So Patreon members, you're going to get exclusive content around that. But before we get to the games, let's stick on the issue of war. Dan, last week there were some comments by the Navy Secretary, I believe, talking about artillery and weapon production. And the headline that got snatched by some people that, frankly, I think want a reason to bang on Ukraine, and it was more of the right-wing media than anyone else, was if we keep supplying Ukraine, we're going to run out of our artillery for ourselves. Right. And it seemed to me like he was really talking about more about supply chain issue and trying to issue a warning to defense contractors that the supply chain issues are starting to track up. And this is a component. But it got twisted into, hey, if we keep supplying Ukraine, we're not going to have enough artillery for ourselves. Can you cut through the bullshit on that and tell us what you think is really going on here?
I do think that coverage got muddled a bit. And you actually saw some stories, kind of second versions of it, that were a bit more clear on what was said and what was not. I do think he was raising alarm over what this could mean, a year from now or something like that. Long-term impact, specific kinds of weapons, I think more so than others. But I don't think this is necessarily about howitzer shells. Like there are many thousands of those going over. There are additional lines coming online as we speak. That has been a priority for months now. And you're starting to see that become a reality in terms of, just additional hot lines, more places that can make them. You've got South Korea assisting now. Like there's a number of ways that has changed. So I don't necessarily think there's a lot of there, but there's some there, particularly on higher end systems that could end up in the fight at some point.
Last question. I think I always ask you this. What's next? What hasn't been reported? I know you can't share reporting that you haven't put out yet, but are there issues or areas of the world or news items on the defense landscape and the Pentagon landscape that we can look toward to not just what's happening now, but what's next?
I mean, the immediate what's next for me is what does it look like in Ukraine this spring, counteroffensive wise? One factor that is getting some discussion, but probably not as much as it should for me. You keep hearing about the muddy season in Ukraine. You can launch a counteroffensive hypothetically before the ground thaws out. Mm-hmm. Then you have a period where it becomes more difficult. Then you kind of hit more of a summery environment where it's more feasible to move around again easily. You can talk about the traditional muddy season, but what's the weather like this year? What's the weather like now? That's a variable that we don't know yet. So when they can do this, when they can be effective doing this, I don't know. How quickly, how much of a factor does it become? Do they try to do it earlier, than things are really thought out? Do they start and then mud becomes a factor partway through? Like that's all got to get sorted out. In terms of other things, non-Ukraine things, I think in coming weeks and months, you're going to start to see, nominations for a replacement for General Milley first. He rotates out by law. He needs to be out of that job by the end of September. And then there's kind of a cascade of effects. General Berger's been in his job in a while in the Marine Corps. General Brown has been in his job in a while in the Air Force. General McConnell is expected to retire. Like there's a number of people that you're going to see go, and a lot of next man up in numerous services. Not quite sure how those chairs get arranged yet. Who ends up being chairman? Who ends up being service chief in some of these places based on who ends up being chairman. And then otherwise, I think you're going to see more reporting out of the Pacific this year. I think the Marine Corps' announcement when Japan was in town in DC, earlier this month, where they talked about having this littoral regiment based on Okinawa that'll spend time on smaller islands southwest of Okinawa. That gets you toward Taiwan. You're not going on Taiwan, but 100 miles out, that kind of idea. And they're at least going to start exercising, trying things, experimenting, and messaging also. So what that looks like, I think, is an interesting story as well.
Yeah. What's next is China, right? Can I ask you one alibi here, as we'd say in the Army? Who's the odds-on favorite to replace Milley? If you had to pick one or two, three names that we should be tracking on that the public won't know until that person is nominated. We've never had a female chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Who do you expect to be the two or three names in the running here?
Yeah, I think that discussion is often easiest to start by saying who it won't be, right? Like, so, like guys like McConville are expected to retire, so he's probably not it. You've got a vice chairman right now who's an admiral, so it's unlikely that you'd end up with another admiral as chairman as well. So you could probably take the Navy out of the mix. That leaves you with the Air Force, the Marine Corps, or possibly the Army again. The odds-on favorites by most accounts are General Brown, the Air Force chief, or General Berger, the Marine Corps chief. And if you end up with either of them, they've both been around a while. They've both been service chiefs for several years. They're both breaking China in their own services in some ways. The Marine Corps in particular, there are a lot of angry people at General Berger over his elimination of tanks and some of the other things, as he does what he thinks is right to, kind of pivot the service more toward Pacific Island kinds of ideas. You could end up with a dark horse. Do you end up with an Army general, again, following General Milley? It's not out of the realm of possible. It's legal. So some of this comes down to who ends up being simpatico with President Biden. You're going to have interviews early in the spring. You'll probably end up with an announcement in March or April, and then things need to move. You need to do confirmations. You need to do meetings between senators and the nominee. You're probably going to have hearings by early summer, and then you've got to have this person in seat by law by October.
It's a great test for this new divided Congress to see if they can get basic shit done, like getting that done. And there's a lot of speculation out there on this stuff, but there's no speculation when it comes to your reporting, man. You continue to be intrepid. I hope you get a Pulitzer this year because you deserve it for all your great work. When the Afghanistan investigations happen, which I think are necessary and overdue, and I hope will be bipartisan. I hope you'll come back for that and come back often during this year. There's a lot happening. And Dan Lamothe, you're always at the forefront of it. So thank you for all the work you do. It's a true public service. Thank you for coming back on the show. And I hope you get to enjoy Brussels a little bit, man.
Yeah, I had a couple of delicious beers last night, but we don't have a ton of downtime here. So, we're at least, boxed in a bit on what we can fit in.
Excellent, man. Appreciate all your good work. Happy New Year. Stay vigilant.
Thank you. You too.